Hello, this is the RPG Crawler, and it is time once again for another Shelf of Many Things, where I take a look at indie and small press tabletop role-playing games and accessories. Now, this time I'm going to be covering an offering from Panic Productions, who were kind enough to send me a review copy of this particular thing. Modern Dungeon 5, or Modern Dungeons, not sure how that's pronounced. I'm just going to pronounce it Modern Dungeon 5. Anyway, this is a third-party supplement for 5th edition that includes both rules and fluff material to ease the task of running a campaign in a modern or very near future setting with or without fantasy elements. Now, this is a little bit of a departure on account of most of the stuff that I cover on this particular series, since Modern Dungeon 5, as of this recording, is not technically released. It's undergoing a Kickstarter with an expected release late next month, so really relatively soon, and the reason they're doing that quick turnaround is, as you can see, the book already largely exists. Basically, they'll just have to cover whatever stretch goals that they actually end up doing. Now, due to the quality and the completion of the particular product in question, I'm going to go ahead and make a exception in this case. I usually don't do it. Now, if you are watching this after a Modern Dungeon 5 is released, keep in mind that there may be minor differences as a result due to this early access to the product. With that said, let's get on into it. Now, the print version of Modern Dungeon 5 is a perfect bound softcover, around 140 pages, with full color cover and a black and white interior, with black and white illustrations in line, 2-column text with appropriate tables. Now, the original cover for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 1st Edition Dungeon Master Guide has given the inspiration to this one, the old Afriti cover to that. There's some minor differences in stances and everything, but this is clearly inspired by it. And this is actually something that Panic Productions has done in the past, since they've got a Modern Adventures thing for Pathfinder that used the idol from the Player's Handbook of the original AD&D books in the background on that cover art. So it's good to see them keeping that tradition alive. As I said, the interior layout is 2-column and interspersed with black and white line art, or black and white contrast art, rather. Tables and so forth as needed. It's pretty standard for an RPG sourcebook. The illustrations are of a different, bolder style than I'm particularly used to, because I'm used to the old school line art style, and this is kind of... It reminds me of some of the sci-fi stuff in the modern genre role-playing games from like the late 90s, early 2000s. I never had a lot of those, but it had that... I don't know if it's comic book style, because I'm not really into comic book style, but it's got a very certain art style to it. Now, the text uses a clear-to-read font with well-placed headers and subheaders that mimic the style of the standard 5th edition stuff, like the main 3 core rulebooks, but without the trade dress involved. So it's got a similar style without having the exact same fonts and layout. It makes it for a pretty easy to navigate product and reference book if you're used to those books, which I can appreciate. Nothing really special, I just appreciate the layout and the craftsmanship designed to make it, readily recognizable. In terms of actual contents, Modern Dungeon 5 has 12 chapters of widely varying lengths. Chapter 1 covers races, Chapter 2 updates the core classes from the Player's Handbook, while Chapter 3 offers completely new classes. Chapter 4 is surprisingly long and offers a bunch of new backgrounds for characters. Chapter 5 covers equipment, especially new equipment for a modern setting. Chapter 6 offers more customization options. Chapter 7 handles what modern actions are covered by what skills and ability checks. Chapter 8 introduces new spells. Chapter 9 has a few new entries into the bestiary. Chapter 10 gives a Dungeon Master information on adjusting challenge ratings and dealing with vehicle chases. Chapter 11 covers technological levels, while Chapter 12 covers world building. Hopefully they'll fix the chapter numbering system for the final release, because I'll get into that a little bit later in my criticisms. Chapter 1's coverage of races has a section for each of the core races from D&D 5th Edition's Player's Handbook, and, there's almost no crunch in this particular chapter, but rather there are updated descriptions for each race, as well as variations, essentially bringing each one of the races up to a sort of a modern world standard. It just gives you information on how they may act, how their culture may have adapted, and so on and so forth. Some of the more egregious, such as Dragonborn and the like, that would stick out like sore thumbs, also have options for living in worlds with what's called the Shroud, which is this mystical method, this mystical phenomena that hides like explicitly supernatural stuff and creatures of myth. And that's kind of something that's discussed way later in the chapter on world building. A few of these races are also given kind of sci-fi or near sci-fi options. So, for instance, you can reskin some of the races as aliens, per se, or as genetically modified humans if you're not into throwing fantasy races into an otherwise modern system. Some of them are a little bit out there and pretty interesting, while some of them are a little bit more stereotypical. For instance, dwarves have a knack for business, and that may be expected, as might half-orcs finding their way in either gangs or the military. Chapter 2 is where we begin to see some actual crunch, as it covers each of the core player handbook classes and introduces possible new archetypes for each one. This is important because a lot of the core classes and archetypes may well work in a modern world as written, but would require some basic changes to their available skills and gear to bring them more up to speed, while others have many archetypes that simply won't fit at all, and thus requiring a few more archetype additions to make up for that fact. Most of the old classes get some proficiency with various firearms thrown in, and some with additional modern tools such as computers or the like as needed. And the starting gear package options have been adjusted to reflect a modern world, so instead of starting with swords and bows, you start, with a handgun or something. As for new archetypes, each one is fleshed out as in any of the archetypes in the core rulebooks. Barbarians get a Path of the Psychopath, which oddly enough gets some social skills. It's kind of an odd case where they represent not only cold-blooded killers, but also manipulative boardroom warriors with no empathy or regard to their victims of their actions. Bards get a new college, the College of Radiance. These represent bards that use light in their performances, whether they be a glam rock style with big light shows or something more down to earth. They get spells suited for manipulation and use of light of various sources, and they get abilities that use light to dazzle, to heal, or to do other things. Clerics get 2 domains. The communication domain, which governs various spells and abilities not only meant to enable communication from person to person, but also at large, either over networks or through empathy or telepathy. The innovation domain, by contrast, gives spells focused on items and item enchantment, or item enhancement rather, as well as a number of abilities that go towards using items better in general and give bonuses on checks, damage, and the like, and so forth. Druids get a new circle, the Circle of Retribution, which has a mix of offensive spells and abilities, as well as some stealth abilities, meant to really turn them into eco-warriors, kind of like the guerrilla warriors that come out and face the big corporations. You get fighters that have the sport fighter archetype, which represents things like boxers, MMA fighters, wrestlers, and so forth. They get a fair amount of unarmed combat abilities, and then, by contrast, monks, who already have, unarmed combat abilities, they get the Way of Immobilization, which focuses on grapples and joint lock type techniques. Paladins get the new Oath, and that's the Oath of Rebirth, which serves as a sort of survivalist-style group, suitable for both modern settings and post-apocalyptic ones. Basically, they're the people that survive the apocalypse and then come out to start rebuilding civilization instead of letting everybody run wild. Rangers, oddly enough, get a fair amount of overhaul, including non-natural terrains in their abilities, where they may take proficiency in urban terrains as well as virtual terrains in computers, as well as a number of abilities using something called liminal points, which are meant to replace a ranger's spellcasting abilities for rangers that operate in non-magical worlds. So for ranger types in non-magical worlds, they can get a variety of abilities that are useful in both urban and wilderness environments, and just not only necessarily increase their combat abilities, but also give them special investigation type stuff. Rangers also get 2 new archetypes, which can be used with either magical rangers or non-magical ones. The first is the Detective, which is exactly what it says on the tin. They function as an investigator, either for a law enforcement agency or for private detection, whatever. They also have the Cybersec agent, which is a cybersecurity agent, which gains various computer-based abilities, so they're rangers in, the internet. Rogues get a rather simple archetype overall, the Trasheur, which I believe is pronounced that way. The Trasheur is basically a parkour specialist. They run, they jump, they get a bunch of movement-based abilities rather than combat-based abilities. Sorcerers get a new origin, but it's really sort of several origins in one. The Psychic origin is meant to simulate psychic abilities, and there's actually 5 different specializations in it, and you pick one of them. Clairvoyant, Pyrokinetic, Spiritualist, Telepath, and Telekinetic. Each one has a new set of expanded spells that are kind of meant to simulate the various psychic abilities for that particular theme. Now, warlocks get a new patron, the Signal, which is a sort of cyber creation, an electronic being in the cloud. They get various abilities with technology and stuff. Wizards can choose the Technomancer tradition in certain worlds, which gives them various electronic skills and enables them to interface their magic with computers. But it should be noted that towards the end in world building, it gives you options for worlds with technology and magic and how they interact. So that particular arcane tradition only works for very specific worlds that have a combination of magic and science that interact with each other. Now, before I continue on with the next chapter, I will say that the finished product, again, may have more archetypes, because that's one of the stretch goals of the Kickstarter. How those archetypes stack up and where they're put, whether they're new or old class archetypes, I'm not sure about. However, I believe this is a decent enough sampling of the types to expect, so if there's more archetypes, well, so be it. The third chapter deals with new classes suited for modern or more often near future settings. The augment uses a science to augment their physical and mental abilities and has 3 archetypes representing the methods that they'd use to do so. The chemical cowboy, genetics, or something called the Jekyll, which I presume is, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde kind of stuff. The general abilities available to all augments include self-healing and durability augments, as well as multiple attacks, not on the same scale as a fighter, but pretty close, and that makes them pretty durable in combat. The Chemical Cowboy focuses on increasing physical abilities. The Geneticist revolves around actually creating a clone or multiple clones at some point. And the Jekyll offers an alternate state that has certain effects on opponents' morale, basically freaking them out. The Augment seems to be a decent fighter type all in all, as I said, although it's more suitable to survival than damage dealing. And the archetypes are different enough to actually feel almost like entirely different classes in terms of playstyle. And this is something that pops up again and again with some of the classes in this supplement. The next major class is the Charmer, which is effectively focusing on social manipulation. Most of their abilities either enable them to manipulate social encounters or use distractions in combat. They also get a motivation ability to allow them to affect others. There are 4 archetypes for the Charmer: the Commander, the Entertainer, the Grimace, and the Undercover Agent. The Commander serves as a party leader or a battle leader and has abilities that give other people under their command various bonuses in battle. The Entertainer gets a few abilities useful in combat as well as out, something of a general all-around archetype, kind of almost like old-school bards in that manner. The Grimace is not a large purple thing, but rather affects the morale of others, including ways to intimidate and browbeat their opponents. Finally, the Undercover Agent gets a number of disguise-based abilities, allowing them to infiltrate areas as well as pretend to be other classes. The Charmer seems to be a mix of the older type of bards and rogues from prior editions, and again, we're faced with a situation where the archetypes are very different from each other, and enough to completely change the playstyle for the class from one to another, although it is to a lesser extent than the Augment. The Expert class uses skill, expertise, and dedication to form their main skill set and gets an arete-based mechanic. At least I think I'm pronouncing that right. Arete gives a pool of points that can be used to then activate other class abilities. The core class abilities deal with skill and tool proficiencies and augmenting them, as well as other general knowledge-based activities. Their archetypes basically focus on their areas of study. They've got a debunker that specializes in uncovering hoaxes and frauds, especially those of the magical or spiritual nature, and they get various observation and some minor abilities that you can use to more generally notice tricks and illusions. They also get some minor gadgets that can be used to duplicate minor spells in a non-magical way. The Hacker deals with computer systems and gains a number of abilities suitable to infiltrate and modify computers and networks. The Medic represents medical knowledge and can duplicate certain healing spells even in non-magical worlds and get a few special strikes that rely on their knowledge of anatomy and bodies. The Occult Scholar has a theoretical knowledge of magic rather than the working magic a wizard might have, and they get some spellcasting abilities and a number of abilities geared towards defense from the magical and supernatural arts. Finally, the Saboteur type deals with explosives and mostly has abilities dealing with different types of detonations. The Expert is one of the most open-ended of the classes thus far, with each of the archetypes using the same arete-based mechanic to produce radically different effects. They aren't unbalanced per se, but they do almost seem to be multiple classes in one, again. The Gadgeteer is the next class, and they use gizmos to duplicate the effects of spells. They almost function like warlocks in that regard, where they have a limited number of spells with a maximum spell slot level, but rather than having their spells cast by supernatural creatures, they use machines to produce them. They also get various tool proficiency-related abilities. Gadgeteer archetypes include the inventor, who gets abilities that augment and improve either existing gizmos or just ordinary objects. The operator, who gains abilities pertaining to operating vehicles very well, driving and the sort. And then the cyborg, who incorporates implants and gizmos to directly augment their own body. Overall, the archetypes for the Gadgeteer are somewhat simpler and slightly more focused than those for the other classes that we've seen thus far, and yet I actually feel that makes the Gadgeteer more resemble the traditional core classes as a result, and that the archetypes do diverge the playstyles but don't make them completely different. The final new class is the Trickster, which combines a bit of skill and luck-based abilities. They get improvisation and pranks-based abilities. They actually get pranks that they can do, like all of them. They have 3 archetypes: the Everyman, the Harlequin, and the Tychomancer. The Everyman is perhaps my favorite archetype included in this particular book for any class. Basically, an Everyman is all luck-based abilities, and the whole premise is that they are accidental adventurers. They're the sort of everyday dude that just wanders around and weird things happen to them, and then they escape or move on through no conscious effort of their own, just raw luck. The Harlequins, by contrast, get a few dodge abilities and seem to be modeled after a certain comic book character. Tychomancers have some spellcasting abilities, and their other abilities basically boil down to luck manipulation. Overall, of the new classes, the Trickster is almost as focused as the Gadgeteer, feeling more like a traditional character class from the player's handbook. Chapter 4 covers backgrounds, and they follow a format almost identical to the ones in the core player's handbook, complete with proficiencies, equipment, special features, and suggested personality traits, ideals, bonds, and flaws. Not going to go over all of them, even though this is one of the larger sections of the book. Basically, they each cover a different real-world profession, as well as a few non-professions, like homeless. The chapter also concludes with a section on single background campaigns, which is basically running a campaign where all the characters have a single background. And that's actually a little bit more suited for modern settings than some of the medieval ones, especially if you're trying to duplicate some sort of genre fiction, for instance, kids on bicycles or a military unit or something. Chapter 5 is the equipment chapter and begins with new starting wealth by class tables. This is partly to handle the new classes and partly because Modern Dungeon5 supplement uses prices in US dollars, so you're going to need those for the old classes as well. There's some variation in terms of selling treasure and guidelines on handling it in the modern world because, let's face it, it's vastly different to find loot and sell it in the modern world in a highly regulated environment than it was in the medieval world. New armor is also given to reflect what's available in the modern world. These are generally just abstracts to represent various broad types of armors available, but also include armor-like outfits, like firefighter suits, as well as biological containment units. Weapons are also listed, and there's a few new types of projectile weapons, as should be expected in a modern term. Automatic weapons that have a variety of attack types are available, as well as shocking weapons, such as tasers and the like. There's also some restriction categories listed for weapons that give general guidelines on the average availability of them in the modern world, although this may, of course, vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. A few types of weapons, such as pepper spray, also offer various special effects that are unique to themselves, or represent things that are not necessarily weapons but can be used as one, such as your friendly fire hose, if you want to just hose somebody down in the middle of a hall. The weapons section does not detail individual firearm types beyond the various categories, so it covers like automatic pistol, revolver, whatnot, but it doesn't break them down further than that. However, there are a series of weapon customizations that can be added to help further detail them out. So if you want to go full Dirty Harry, you can slap a heavy caliber quality onto a revolver and go from there. There are some general rules for other items, explosives for instance, as well as other adventuring gear that is more suited for the modern world than the medieval world. This includes new toolkits that are available only in the modern day. A few modern versions of older kit types are also listed as well, and these can be more effective than their medieval counterparts. The equipment packs from the player's handbook, the like Explorer's pack and such, are updated here. They retain their names, but have had their equipment adjusted to reflect what that particular type of pack might contain in the modern world. Equipment also includes abstract gear, such as software useful for various tasks in the game, and there's even an entire section on computer use and hacking, which can be enough to base an entire adventure off of. The vehicles section offers expanded rules for vehicle use and interactions to reflect modern motor vehicles and the options that they produce, as well as including a number of maneuvers that one can use while in vehicle-to-vehicle combat. There's expanded statistics for a variety of water, ground, and air vehicles that are not only present in the modern era, but may only be available in the modern era, as well as options for customizing particular vehicles if you want. The next chapter covers customization options, starting with the basic rules for multi-classing with the new classes, as well as some feats. The new feats are on par with those described in the player's handbook, and a couple of them may well be useful even in a medieval fantasy-based setting, being rather generic and not overly reliant on modern technology. Chapter 7 covers ability checks, which mostly revolve around skills. There's no new skills in modern Dungeon 5, but there is a handy list of modern activities and what classic skills and tool proficiencies that they fall under. Chapter 8 introduces a number of new spells for all the spellcasting classes. They are suitable for use in modern settings, and there's only a few that might actually be useful in old settings, with most of them requiring, technological devices and computers to actually have effect. Chapter 9 is the bestiary, but there's no actual beasts in it. Rather, it's just stats for several NPC types, covering a variety of common threats and allies that you might interact with in a modern setting. Chapter 10 covers dungeon mastering, which mostly consists of adjustments to challenge rating based on the greater threat that firearms produce at lower levels, as well as expanded rules for vehicle chases. These rules are necessarily somewhat abstract, but rather designed to reflect the sort of cinematic car chase you'd see in any action movie, and they do a pretty good job of that. The next chapter covers technology levels, and mostly gives guidelines to fitting technology of different origins into a modern genre game. There is kind of some examples of what fits in like a technology, like a Tech Plus 1 or a Tech Plus 2 particular object. The final chapter of the book covers world building, but mostly details the various levels of magic that you might have in a modern genre game, as well as how the magic may interact with technology and how that magic has acted over history. So you can actually take those three aspects of magic and come up with completely different settings as a result. So that's the general contents of Modern Dungeon 5. It is well written all in all, organized to mimic and mirror the core rulebooks in terms of material placement and formatting. So if you're familiar with the Player's Handbook and the Dungeon Master's Guide, then you'll have no problem navigating this book at all. There are some minor editing issues that should probably be cleared up by the time that the final release comes along. The chapter numbering fell off the rails around chapter 10, and there's a bit of a habit in the text to repeat words in order to provide emphasis. I think this is a holdover from the author's general writing style, but ideally that should probably be minimized. Not necessarily, dissing the author's writing style, but just for general purposes, you may want to limit that. It's nitpicky, I know, but, if I've got a nitpick in order to criticize a product, then that may as well be taken as a compliment, because that means there's no major overall glaring errors that I noticed. In terms of the contents themselves, I found that the new material is very well balanced all in all. The lack of actual crunch when dealing with the races is understandable, as you don't really want to change those too much, and I found the new archetypes for the classic classes to be quite well done, although some are clearly more interesting than others. I, for one, can see myself playing an American psychopath-style barbarian executive in the game. The new classes, I'm a little bit of a mixed bag on. They aren't unbalanced, and they seem to fit the modern genre game quite well, but I think a couple of the classes, most notably the Augment and another one, the Charmer and whatnot, they're just too broad in their effects when you add the archetypes to them, and likely would have been better off being split into like 2 or more classes. Still, it's not going to break a particular game. It just means that the character might provide vastly different roles to the party depending on the build, more so in the classic classes than the Player's Handbook. If you're looking at old school D&D or even just modern D&D, but just the 3 books, if you're talking about a cleric, you've got a pretty good idea of what that cleric can do, even if they pick different domains. If you've got a fighter, they can be ranged or melee, but even if they pick one of the spellcasting archetypes, they're usually going to do the same kind of role in the particular group, that is either tanking or damage. In this one of those classes, like an Augment or whatever, it can fill like multiple widely dispersed roles depending on what archetype they are. So that can be a little bit harder to put a competent party together if there's huge gaps in what's expected of each particular class. The weaponry and armor are well balanced, and I do like how they handle the automatic weapons fire rules in the game. That gives them several options, and every time you got a fully automatic weapon. The chase rules are useful too, and I could actually see myself working out a medieval fantasy version of them for more classic D&D, since they rely on like randomized tables, and they could easily be switched over for a sort of more fantasy setting in a chase through a city. I'm less sure about the computer use and hacking rules, not for any problem with the rules as presented, but they're always among the most difficult to codify for a game. And I think modern Dungeon5 does a decent job at it, but it's just a messy thing overall in any time you adapt computer hacking and such to a rule system and don't want to just boil it down to a simple skill roll. All in all, modern Dungeon5 looks like it's going to be a fairly solid reference for running modern or near future games with D&D rules. I honestly don't like modern settings that much in terms of my role-playing. I try to avoid them. So keep that in mind when you're looking back at this particular review. Having said that, I could see myself using this particular product in a game anyway, even with my dislike of modern settings. So I guess I do have to recommend it even as it is. Now, again, as of this recording, it's still in the Kickstarter phase, so contents may change a little bit before future release, but I expect only a few things to be added rather than things to be drastically overhauled. And on that note, I'm going to wrap it up here. I will put relevant links in the description below for the Kickstarter right now, and, when it's done with its release and come back up, I'll put a link to purchase it down there. This has been the RPG Crawler with my shelf of many things Modern Dungeon 5. If you like what you've seen, remember to leave a like, comment if you got any feedback, and subscribe for more RPG content, both tabletop and computer. Until next time, take care and goodbye. And if you're still watching this far, I'd like to take a moment to thank those who have supported this channel via Patreon or direct donations throughout the years, without which this channel could not have lasted as long as it has. For those who are feeling particularly generous, you can still support my work through Patreon and now through Subscribestar as well, through the links in the description below.